I never thought I'd be the one to find something like this. When I got the call from Wildlife Services that morning, I figured it was just another routine job. Track down an aggressive bear, relocate it, or put it down if necessary. I'd done it dozens of times before. But what I found in those woods that day changed everything I thought I knew about what's out there. Some things you can't unsee, and some truths you can't unknow. This is what happened to me on Kodiak Island, and I'm still trying to make sense of it. The call came in around 7 in the morning, just as I was finishing my first cup of coffee. The dispatcher's voice had that edge to it that tells you something serious. A farmer on the eastern side of Kodiak Island had reported an attack on his cattle. One of his steers had been killed and dragged into the forest. The farmer claimed he'd shot at whatever did it, fired twice, and was certain he'd hit it at least once, maybe twice. He said it was a bear, a massive Kodiak, probably close to 2,000 pounds based on the size and strength it displayed. By Alaska state law, any incident involving a bear attacking livestock has to be reported to Wildlife Services immediately. But this farmer wanted more than just a report filed. He wanted someone to track this thing down and deal with it. He said the bear had been stalking his property for weeks, circling his land at night, making strange noises, leaving massive tracks everywhere. His voice on the phone was shaky, scared even. And farmers don't scare easily. These are people who live on the edge of the wilderness their whole lives. They know how to handle bears. So if this guy was spooked, that told me something was different about this situation. I'd been working with Wildlife Services for going on 15 years at that point. Started right out of college with a degree in wildlife biology and a minor in ecology. Some people dream of working in labs or teaching at universities. Me, I'd always wanted to be out in the field, dealing with actual animals in their natural environment. There's something pure about it, something real. You're not studying behavior from a distance or reading about it in textbooks. You're right there in the middle of it, making split-second decisions that can mean the difference between a successful relocation and a deadly encounter. Over those 15 years, I'd tracked just about everything Alaska had to offer. Black bears, brown bears, Kodiak bears, mountain lions, wolves, moose that had gotten aggressive near populated areas. Each species has its own patterns, its own logic. Bears, for instance, are usually pretty straightforward. They're looking for food, and they'll take the path of least resistance to get it. They're not malicious, just opportunistic. A bear that breaks into cabins or starts preying on livestock is usually just a bear that's learned humans equal easy food. You tranquilize them, relocate them far away, and most of the time that solves the problem. Kodiak bears are the biggest of the brown bears, and they're something special. Adult males can weigh anywhere from 1,200 to 1,600 pounds, with some individuals pushing 2,000. They're powerful enough to flip over 800-pound boulders looking for food, fast enough to run down a caribou if they want to. But despite their size and strength, they're generally not aggressive toward humans. Most attacks happen when a bear is startled or when a mother is protecting her cubs. If you give them space and respect, they'll usually leave you alone. That's why this call struck me as unusual. An adult Kodiak actively stalking a farm, killing livestock, not running away when shot at. That's not typical behavior. But I'd dealt with unusual situations before. Just last spring, I'd tracked a male black bear that had developed a taste for trash and had broken into 5 different cabins over the course of 2 weeks. That bear had zero fear of humans, would stand its ground even when people were yelling and banging pots. It took me 3 days to track him down, but I finally cornered him in a box canyon, tranquilized him, and had him relocated to a remote area over 200 miles away. Problem solved. So while this Kodiak situation was concerning, I wasn't overly worried. I packed my gear, tranquilizer rifle, tracking kit, GPS, radio, plenty of water and emergency supplies, and headed out. The drive to the farm took about an hour and a half. Kodiak Island is big, over 3,500 square miles, and much of it is wilderness. The road I was on was barely more than a dirt track, winding through dense forest with the occasional glimpse of mountains in the distance. This was real backcountry, the kind of place where you could go days without seeing another person. The kind of place where the wild still ruled. When I finally pulled up to the farm, I could see why the farmer had been so shaken. The place was isolated, surrounded on 3 sides by thick forest with mountains looming behind. There were a few outbuildings, a barn, some fencing for the cattle, and a small house, but that was it. No neighbors for miles, no backup if something went wrong, just one man trying to make a living on the edge of civilization. The farmer was waiting for me on his porch. He was maybe in his 50s, weathered face, calloused hands, the kind of guy who'd spent his whole life working outdoors. But his hands were shaking slightly when he shook mine, and his eyes kept darting toward the tree line like he expected something to come charging out at any moment. That was my first real warning sign. People who live this far out don't spook easily. They're used to bears, used to the dangers of living in wild country. If this guy was this rattled, something was seriously wrong. He led me out to the attack site without much small talk. We walked across his property, past the barn, out toward where the grassland met the forest. And the scene that greeted us was brutal. The ground was torn up, grass ripped out in clumps, dirt gouged with deep furrows. There were drag marks leading from the middle of the field straight toward the trees, and they were massive. Whatever had done this had incredible strength. The marks were at least 2 feet wide, carved deep into the earth. The steer itself, what was left of it, was lying at the very edge of the forest, maybe 10 feet from where the trees started. It was a 600-pound animal, and it had been dragged at least 100 yards. Most of the carcass was still intact, but there were chunks torn off, scattered around the area. The blood was everywhere, pooled in the grass, splattered on nearby bushes, trailing off into the forest in thick, dark streaks. I knelt down to examine the carcass more closely, and that's when I noticed the first thing that didn't quite add up. The bite marks were wrong. I've seen hundreds of bear kills over the years, and bears have a very distinctive pattern. They usually go for the throat or the belly, trying to bring down the prey as quickly as possible. The bite marks are clean, powerful, but methodical. These wounds were different. They looked more like something had just grabbed and torn, with no real strategy behind it. The flesh was shredded rather than punctured. It was messy, chaotic, almost frenzied. The farmer stood a few feet away, watching me work. I asked him to walk me through what happened. He said it was around dusk the previous evening, maybe 6:30 or 7. He'd been in his barn when he heard his cattle start bellowing, that panicked sound they make when something's wrong. He grabbed his rifle and ran outside. By the time he got there, he could see something dragging one of his steers toward the forest. It was getting dark, so he couldn't make out details, but he could see the size of it. Huge, he said, way bigger than any bear he'd ever seen. And he'd been living on this island for over 30 years, so he'd seen plenty of bears. He raised his rifle and fired twice. He was sure he hit it at least once, maybe both times. He saw it react, saw it stumble slightly. But it didn't drop the steer, didn't run away. It just kept dragging that 600-pound animal like it weighed nothing, disappearing into the trees. The farmer didn't follow. He said the way it moved, the sounds it was making, it wasn't right. It wasn't natural. So he went back inside, locked his doors, and called wildlife services first thing in the morning. I asked him about the stalking behavior he'd mentioned. He said it started maybe 3 weeks ago. He'd hear something moving around his property at night, heavy footsteps, the kind that you can feel through the ground, and noises, deep grunting sounds that didn't quite match anything he was familiar with. Bears grunt, sure, but these were different. Lower, more resonant, almost like vocalizations rather than simple animal sounds. He'd go outside with a flashlight, but he never saw anything, just heard it moving in the darkness beyond his fence line. He said he'd found tracks too, massive prints all around his property, near his barn, by his water trough, circling his house. At first he thought they were bear tracks, but they didn't look right. Too elongated, he said, and no claw marks. He'd shown them to a neighbor who used to do some hunting, and even that guy was puzzled. But what were they going to do? It's not illegal for a bear to walk around, and without an actual attack, wildlife services wouldn't prioritize sending someone out. So the farmer just lived with it, getting more nervous each night until finally the thing killed one of his animals. I listened to all of this, and I'll admit it was strange. The stalking behavior, the weird sounds, the unusual tracks, none of it quite fit the profile of a typical Kodiak bear. But animals can behave unpredictably, especially if they're sick or injured or have developed abnormal habits. I'd seen bears do strange things before. So while it was concerning, I chalked it up to an individual animal with unusual behavior patterns. Probably a big male that had lost its fear of humans and had developed a taste for easy prey. The solution would be the same regardless. Track it down, tranquilize it if possible, or put it down if it proved too aggressive. I radioed wildlife services to let them know I was beginning the track. Standard protocol. They logged my position and told me to check in every 2 hours. If I didn't check in, they'd send a search party. It's a safety measure we always follow when tracking dangerous animals in remote areas. Then I shouldered my pack, checked my tranquilizer rifle, and followed the blood trail into the forest. The trail was immediately obvious. There was so much blood that a child could have followed it. Thick splatters on the undergrowth, smeared on tree trunks, pooled in depressions in the ground. The drag marks continued into the forest, 2 parallel furrows where the steer's body had been pulled along. And every 20 feet or so, there'd be a footprint in the soft earth, massive impressions that looked almost like craters in the forest floor. I'd expected the trail to be short. An animal that's been shot twice and is bleeding this heavily shouldn't be able to go far. A mile, maybe 2 at the absolute most, before blood loss and shock would bring it down. But I walked for an hour, then 2 hours, and the trail just kept going. The blood never lessened. If anything, there seemed to be more of it the deeper I went. Whatever this creature was, it should have been dead 3 times over based on the amount of blood it was losing. The forest was dense here, old-growth spruce and hemlock towering overhead, their branches blocking out most of the sunlight. The understory was thick with ferns and devil's club, that nasty plant with spines that'll tear your skin open if you brush against it wrong. It was slow going, and I had to watch my footing constantly. One wrong step and you could twist an ankle or go tumbling down a slope. What struck me as I walked was the silence. Normally, a forest like this would be full of sound. Birds calling, squirrels chattering, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. But there was nothing, just an oppressive, heavy silence broken only by the sound of my own footsteps and breathing. It's the kind of silence you get when predators are around, when every prey animal has gone to ground and is hiding. The forest knew something dangerous was here. After about 3 hours of tracking, I started noticing other signs that didn't make sense. There were marks on the trees, deep gouges in the bark, some of them fresh enough that sap was still seeping out. But they were high, way higher than any bear could reach, even standing on its hind legs. I'm talking 10 to 12 feet up. And the pattern was wrong. Bear claws leave parallel grooves, neat and orderly. These marks were more chaotic, more random, like something had just raked its claws down the trunk in frustration or anger. Then I crossed a small stream and found footprints in the soft mud on the far bank, clear, distinct impressions that stopped me in my tracks. They were enormous, easily 18 inches long and 7 or 8 inches wide. But the shape was all wrong for a bear. Bear prints have 5 distinct toes arranged in a crescent, a large pad in the middle, and claw marks extending an inch or more beyond the toes. These prints had what looked like 5 toes, but they were thick and splayed out, almost prehensile looking. The pad was more elongated than rounded, and there were no claw marks at all. The overall shape was disturbingly human-like, just scaled up to an impossible size. I crouched down and examined those prints for a long time. My mind was racing, trying to find an explanation that made sense. Maybe it was a bear, and the soft mud had distorted the print somehow. Maybe multiple prints had overlapped and created this weird shape. But even as I thought it, I knew that wasn't right. These were clean, individual prints. Deep impressions where something massive had walked upright on 2 legs. I took out my camera and photographed the prints from multiple angles. Part of me wanted documentation in case I needed to show someone later, but another part of me, the part that was starting to feel uneasy, wanted proof that I wasn't losing my mind, because what those prints suggested was impossible. There was no animal in North America that left tracks like that. Nothing with feet that large that walked upright on 2 legs. Nothing that should exist. I radioed in my second check-in, keeping my voice steady even though my hands were starting to shake slightly. I reported that I was still on the trail, that the blood loss was significant, and that I expected to locate the animal soon. I didn't mention the unusual tracks or the marks on the trees. What would I have said? That I was following something that left human-shaped footprints the size of snowshoes? They would have thought I was joking or had hit my head, so I kept it professional, confirmed my GPS coordinates, and kept moving. The trail started climbing now, working its way up a gradual slope toward the mountains. The terrain got rockier, the soil giving way to loose gravel and exposed stone. The trees thinned out slightly, letting in more light but also making the temperature drop. I could feel the air getting colder as I climbed, and I could see my breath starting to fog in front of my face. 4 hours in now, and my legs were starting to burn from the climb. I stopped to drink some water and check my bearings. The blood trail was still heavy, but I was starting to see other things that disturbed me. There was a crude structure off to the side of the trail. I almost missed it at first. It was made from bent saplings and branches, arranged in a rough dome shape. It looked almost like a shelter, except no human had made it. The branches were thick, some of them snapped off trees that were 6 inches in diameter. Whatever had built this had incredible strength, and the construction, while crude, showed intention. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. I approached the structure carefully, my hand on my sidearm. Up close, I could see that it was big enough for something large to fit inside, maybe 8 feet across and 6 feet high. There were what looked like bedding materials inside, dried grass and moss arranged in a rough pile. And there was that smell. God, that smell. It hit me like a physical force. Musky, pungent, like wet dog mixed with rot, and something else I couldn't identify. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I had to step back and breathe through my mouth to keep from gagging. Bears have a smell, sure. Any wild animal does. But this was different. This was overpowering, almost chemically strong, like the animal was marking its territory with scent. I'd never encountered anything like it. And the fact that something was building shelters, creating bedding, showing signs of complex behavior, that wasn't bear behavior. That was something else entirely. I should have turned back then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me that something was wrong, that I was tracking something I didn't understand. But I'd already come so far, invested so many hours. And I kept thinking about that farmer, scared and alone on his property, wondering if this thing would come back. I couldn't just abandon the track and leave him without answers. So I took some more photos, noted the location on my GPS, and kept following the blood trail. The sun was starting to drop lower in the sky now. I'd been tracking for over 5 hours, covering what I estimated was 7 or 8 miles of rough terrain. My water was running low, and I was starting to think about having to camp overnight if I didn't find this thing soon. The thought of spending the night out here, alone with whatever was making these tracks nearby, that thought made my stomach clench. The forest opened up ahead, and I found myself at the base of a sheer rock face. The mountain rose up maybe 200 feet, all vertical stone and sparse vegetation. And at the bottom, spread out before me, was a clearing maybe 40 yards across. The grass here was yellowed and sparse, and there were rocks scattered across the ground. And in the middle of the clearing, I saw it. At first, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. It looked like a dark boulder or maybe a fallen tree. But as I got closer, stepping cautiously into the clearing, the shape resolved into something that made my heart start hammering in my chest. It was a body, a massive body covered in dark, matted hair. And it was lying on its side, motionless. I approached slowly, my tranquilizer rifle raised even though I could tell the thing wasn't moving. As I got closer, the details became clearer, and each detail made less sense than the last. This was no bear. It was bipedal, built to walk upright. Its legs were thick and muscular, bent at the knee even in death. Its torso was massive and barrel-shaped, broader than any human's. Its arms, and they were arms, not front legs, were long and powerful, the muscles visible even through the thick hair. I circled around to get a look at its head, and that's when I knew for certain this wasn't any animal I'd ever studied. The face was flat, not elongated like a bear's muzzle. The skull was conical, rising to a peaked crown. Its nose was broad and flat, its jaw heavy and pronounced. Even in death, there was something almost human about the proportions, but scaled up and distorted. It was like looking at some evolutionary cousin that had diverged from the human family tree millions of years ago and developed along a completely different path. The hands were what really got me. They were enormous, each finger as thick as my wrist, but they had thumbs, opposable thumbs. The palms were broad and flat, the fingers long and capable of grasping. These weren't paws. These were hands designed for manipulation and fine motor control, just built on a scale that seemed impossible. I could see the bullet wounds now, one in the upper torso just below the shoulder, another in the abdomen. The farmer had hit his target both times. The fur around the wounds was matted with dried blood, and I could see where the creature had bled out during its long trek through the forest. The body was still slightly warm. I could see steam rising off it in the cool mountain air. It had died recently, maybe in the last hour or two. I stood there for what felt like forever, just staring at this impossible thing. My scientific training, my years of experience, everything I knew about zoology and wildlife biology, none of it had prepared me for this. This creature shouldn't exist. It couldn't exist. And yet here it was, dead at my feet, as real as the rocks and trees around me. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever name you wanted to give it, that's what this was. I'd heard the stories my entire life, like everyone has. The legends, the supposed sightings, the grainy photos, and shaky video footage that always seemed just a little too convenient to be real. I'd dismissed all of it as folklore, misidentification, people seeing bears and letting their imaginations run. That's when I saw the cave. It was maybe 50 yards away, a dark opening in the rock face that I hadn't noticed before because I'd been so focused on the body. The opening was large, easily 12 feet high and maybe 15 feet wide, and something was moving inside. I could see shadows shifting in the darkness, hear the shuffle of heavy footsteps on stone. Then one of them stepped out into the light. It was alive and it was looking right at me. The creature was massive, easily as large as the dead one on the ground. Its hair was dark brown, almost black in the fading sunlight. It moved on two legs with a strange, loping gait, its long arms swinging at its sides, and it was walking directly toward the body, its attention focused on its fallen companion. It hadn't seen me yet. I was downwind, and I'd frozen in place, barely breathing. Then another one emerged from the cave. And another. I counted 4 of them in total, all similar in size, all moving toward the dead creature with those low, rumbling vocalizations. They gathered around the body, and the sounds they made changed, became almost mournful. One of them reached down and touched the wounds, its massive hand moving with surprising gentleness. They were grieving. These creatures were showing complex emotional behavior, mourning their dead. That's when the full weight of what I was seeing hit me. This wasn't just one creature, some lone anomaly. This was a group, a family group probably. They had a den, a social structure, complex behaviors. This was a species, a population that had somehow managed to avoid detection by living in the most remote corners of the wilderness. And I'd just stumbled into their home, standing next to their dead family member. I started backing away slowly, inch by inch, trying not to make any sudden movements. I was maybe 30 yards from the tree line. If I could just make it back into the forest, I could put some distance between me and them, get back to the farm, call in reinforcements. My hand was on my tranquilizer rifle, but I knew it would be useless. I had maybe 3 darts loaded and there were 4 of them. And even if I managed to take one down, the others would be on me before I could reload. I'd made it maybe 10 yards when one of them stopped. It had been crouched over the body, examining it, but now it straightened up to its full height. It must have been 8.5, maybe 9 feet tall, standing upright. Its head tilted slightly, and it lifted its nose to the air. I watched as its nostrils flared, testing the wind, and then its head swiveled in my direction. For a moment, we just stared at each other across the clearing. Its eyes were small and dark, set deep in its skull, and there was an intelligence there that was unmistakable. This wasn't some dumb animal acting on instinct. This thing was thinking, assessing, making decisions. And I could see the exact moment when it recognized me as a threat. The others noticed its change in posture and turned to look at me as well. 4 sets of eyes fixed on me, and the clearing went absolutely silent. Nobody moved. The moment stretched out, seconds feeling like minutes, the tension so thick I could barely breathe. And then one of them, the largest one, a massive male with shoulders that looked like they could tear a tree in half, opened its mouth and roared. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard. It wasn't a bear roar or a lion's roar or any sound I could compare to anything natural. It was deep and booming, resonating in my chest, setting off every primal alarm my nervous system had. It was a sound that said danger, that said predator, that said run or die. So I ran. I turned and bolted for the tree line, all thoughts of stealth abandoned. Behind me, I heard them coming. The ground shook with their footsteps, branches snapped, and that roaring sound cut through the air again and again. I crashed into the forest at full speed, my boots slipping on loose rocks, branches whipping at my face. I didn't look back. Looking back would slow me down, and slowing down would mean death. The forest here was dense, the trees close together, and I used every bit of that to my advantage. I weaved between trunks, ducked under low-hanging branches, jumped over fallen logs. I could hear them behind me, crashing through the undergrowth like freight trains. They were faster than I would have thought possible for something that size. Each footfall sounded like thunder getting closer, closer. But they were also bigger than me, bulkier, and that worked in my favor. They couldn't maneuver through the tight spaces between trees as easily as I could. When I could fit between two trees growing close together, they had to go around. It was the only advantage I had, and I exploited it ruthlessly. Every time I saw a narrow gap, I took it, forcing them to adjust their path. My lungs were burning, my legs screaming in protest, but I couldn't slow down. I could still hear them, sometimes close enough that I could hear their breathing. Deep, raspy huffs that sounded almost like words. And then I realized something that made my blood run cold. They weren't just chasing me, they were communicating with each other. Those grunts and calls weren't random. They were coordinating, spreading out, trying to flank me and cut off my escape routes. I needed to change tactics. Running in a straight line would eventually fail. I was getting tired, and they didn't seem to be slowing down at all. So I started taking unexpected turns, doubling back on my trail, using every trick I knew from years of tracking to confuse my pursuers. I cut toward a stream I'd crossed earlier, hoping the water would break up my scent trail. When I hit the stream, I didn't cross it. Instead, I ran upstream, splashing through the shallow water for maybe 200 yards. The cold water soaked my boots and sent shocks of ice up my legs, but I didn't care. Water disrupts scent, makes tracking harder. If I could buy myself even a few minutes, it might be enough. I finally climbed out on the opposite bank and took cover behind a massive old cedar tree. My chest was heaving, my heart pounding so hard I could see my vision pulsing with each beat. I forced myself to breathe quietly, listening for sounds of pursuit. For a moment, there was silence. Then I heard them, those deep grunts and calls, but they sounded more spread out now, coming from different directions. They'd lost my immediate trail and were searching. I used the moment to try and orient myself. The sun was getting low, maybe an hour of good light left. I needed to figure out which direction would take me back to the farm. I pulled out my GPS with shaking hands, trying to get a fix on my position. The device took forever to acquire satellites, and every second felt like an eternity. Finally, it locked on. I was maybe 6 miles from the farm, mostly downhill if I could get to the right heading. I started moving again, quieter this time. I couldn't keep up that panicked sprint. I had to be smart, use my training. I moved from cover to cover, pausing every few yards to listen. Sometimes I'd hear them in the distance, those grunting calls echoing through the forest. Other times there'd be silence, which was almost worse. At least when I could hear them, I knew roughly where they were. I came across a steep ravine and half climbed, half slid down into it. The slope was maybe 40 feet of loose gravel and exposed roots, and I grabbed onto whatever I could find to control my descent. At the bottom, I crouched behind a boulder and listened. Above me, I could hear movement along the ridge. One of them was up there, moving parallel to the ravine. It couldn't see me from that angle, but it was tracking me somehow. Maybe it had picked up my trail again. Maybe it was just systematically searching. Either way, I needed to keep moving. I followed the ravine for maybe half a mile before it opened up into more level ground. The forest was different here. More undergrowth, thicker brush, lots of blackberry brambles. Those thorny bushes were hell to move through, but they'd be even worse for something as large as those creatures. I spotted a particularly thick patch and pushed into it, ignoring the thorns that tore at my clothes and skin. The pain was nothing compared to the fear. On the other side of the thicket, I paused to catch my breath. My arms were covered in scratches, some of them bleeding, and my jacket was torn in a dozen places. But I'd bought myself some distance. I could still hear them searching, but the sounds were farther away now. The thorns had been worth it. I pulled off my jacket and looked at it for a moment. Then I threw it as far as I could in the opposite direction I was planning to go. It was an old trick, using something with your scent to create a false trail. Animals that hunt by scent will sometimes follow the item instead of you. It doesn't work for long, but it doesn't have to, just long enough to create confusion, to make them waste time investigating the wrong path. I kept moving, trying to stay aware of the wind direction. I wanted to keep the wind in my face so my scent would blow back the way I'd come instead of forward where I was going. It's basic hunting knowledge. Animals have powerful noses and scent travels on the wind. If I could stay downwind of them, I had a better chance of remaining undetected. The terrain started to look familiar. I'd passed through here on my way up, following the blood trail. That meant I was getting closer to the farm, closer to safety. The knowledge gave me a burst of energy, and I picked up my pace. But I forced myself to stay careful, to not let hope make me careless. I was still miles from safety, and those things were still out there somewhere. Then I heard something that froze me in place. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming from just ahead. I dove behind a large boulder, pressing myself against the cold stone, trying to become invisible. Through a gap in the rocks, I could see one of them moving through the trees. It was walking slowly, methodically, its head swinging from side to side as it searched. It was hunting me, and it was being patient about it. The creature came within 20 feet of my hiding spot and stopped. It stood there, completely still, and I watched as it lifted its head and sniffed the air. Its nostrils flared, testing the breeze. I held my breath, not daring to move a muscle. My heart was pounding so loud I was certain it could hear it. The creature took a step closer, then another. It was less than 15 feet away now, so close I could see the individual hairs on its body, could see the muscles moving under its skin. And that smell? God, that overpowering, musky odor was everywhere, so strong it was making my eyes water. I pressed my face against my shirt, trying to breathe through the fabric, trying not to cough or gag. The creature stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two. Then, slowly, it turned and moved away, heading in a slightly different direction. It hadn't found me. The boulder in the wind direction had saved me. I waited until I couldn't hear it anymore before I moved. When I finally did, my whole body was shaking, part adrenaline, part relief, part sheer terror at how close I'd come to being discovered. That thing had been right there, close enough to touch if I'd reached out. And if it had looked around the boulder, if the wind had shifted just slightly and carried my scent to it, I'd be dead. I kept moving, but slower now, more carefully. Every step was deliberate. I avoided dry branches that might snap, stuck to softer ground where my footsteps would be quieter. I moved from cover to cover, never exposing myself in open areas. It was agonizingly slow progress, but speed would just get me caught. Better to be slow and alive than fast and dead. The sun was touching the horizon now, casting long shadows through the trees. Maybe 45 minutes of light left, probably less. I couldn't afford to be caught out here in the dark. In daylight, I at least had a chance. I could see them coming, could use the terrain to my advantage. But in the dark, I'd be helpless. They probably had better night vision than I did, and they knew this forest. I'd be stumbling blind while they hunted me. I reached a ridge and looked down. There, maybe half a mile below, I could see where the forest ended and open farmland began. I could see the farmhouse, small in the distance, lights already glowing in the windows. I'd made it. I'd actually made it. The sight filled me with such relief I almost cried. But I wasn't safe yet. Half a mile of forest still lay between me and that open ground. I started down the slope, moving as quickly as I dared. The terrain here was steep and loose, and I had to watch my footing constantly. One wrong step and I could go tumbling down the hillside, break an ankle, and that would be the end of it. So I moved carefully but steadily, always keeping that farmhouse in sight, using it as my beacon. The forest started to thin out. The trees became more sparse, the undergrowth less dense. I was close now, maybe a quarter mile from the tree line. And then I heard them again, those grunting calls, but they were behind me now, higher up the slope. They were still searching, still hunting. But I was ahead of them, and the tree line was right there. I broke into a run, exhaustion forgotten. My legs found energy I didn't know I had left. I crashed through the last of the undergrowth and burst out of the tree line into the open field. The grass here was waist high, and I plowed through it, my eyes locked on the farmhouse ahead. The open ground felt both terrifying and liberating. No cover, nothing to hide behind, but also nothing to slow me down. I couldn't help myself. I glanced back over my shoulder, and my breath caught in my throat. They were there, at the tree line, 4 massive shapes emerging from the forest into the fading light. They weren't running, weren't rushing. They were walking slowly, deliberately, their forms silhouetted against the darkening sky. And they were watching me, just standing there and watching. That's when I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life. My lungs felt like they were on fire. My legs were rubber. But I pushed through it. The farmhouse was getting closer, the lights in the windows growing brighter. I could see the barnyard now, could make out the farmer's truck parked near the house. Just a little farther, just a little more. I stumbled as I reached the farmyard, almost falling, my legs barely able to hold me up. The farmer must have heard me coming because the door to his house flew open and he came running out. His eyes were wide, taking in my appearance, torn clothes, covered in scratches and mud, gasping for breath like I'd run a marathon. I must have looked like I'd been through hell, because I had. He started to ask what happened, but I grabbed his arm and pulled him toward his truck. Words were trying to form, but I couldn't get them out, couldn't explain. All I could manage was to gasp out that we needed to leave, needed to go now. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip his arm. He looked at me, confused and concerned, but I think he saw something in my eyes. Raw terror, maybe, or shock. Whatever it was, it convinced him. He didn't argue or ask more questions. He just ran for his truck, and I followed, every step an effort. As he fumbled with his keys, I turned back toward the field, and my heart stopped. They were still coming, moving slowly across the open ground, 4 massive shapes in the gathering darkness. They were maybe 200 yards away and closing. The farmer saw them too. His face went pale, his hands shaking so badly the keys slipped from his fingers. He bent down, grabbed them, tried again. The truck roared to life, and the sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet of dusk. The farmer threw it in reverse, spun it around, and floored the accelerator. Gravel sprayed everywhere as we tore down his driveway, the truck fishtailing slightly before the tires found purchase. I twisted in my seat to look out the back window. The creatures had reached the edge of the farmyard now, standing where we'd been moments before. They didn't chase the truck. They just stood there, watching us leave, their dark forms growing smaller and smaller until the darkness swallowed them completely. We drove in silence for a long time. The farmer's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping. I just sat there, trying to process what had happened, trying to slow my breathing, trying to convince myself it was real and not some fever dream. But the scratches on my arms were real. The ache in my legs was real. And those creatures standing at the edge of that farmyard, they were real too. The Wildlife Services office was about 30 miles from the farm, and we made the drive in maybe 25 minutes. The farmer drove like he was being chased, even though nothing was behind us. We pulled into the parking lot, and I sat there for a moment, my hand on the door handle, trying to gather the strength to move. Everything hurt, every muscle, every joint. I felt like I'd aged 10 years in the last few hours. The office was mostly empty, just a few people working late shifts. I walked in and asked to speak to whoever was in charge. The woman at the desk took one look at me and immediately got on her radio. A supervisor appeared within a minute, took in my appearance, and ushered me into a back office without a word. The farmer followed, his hand still shaking. I sat down in a chair and just started talking. I told them everything. The blood trail, the unusual tracks, the structures in the forest, the body I'd found in the clearing, the others emerging from the cave, the chase through the forest, how they'd coordinated, communicated, worked together to try to catch me. The supervisor was writing everything down, but I could see the skepticism on his face, the way his eyebrows kept rising, the occasional glances he'd exchange with another officer who'd joined us. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then the supervisor asked the question I'd been dreading. Did I have any photos? Any evidence beyond my testimony? I explained that I'd taken photos of the tracks in the shelter. But once I found the body and realized there were others, there hadn't been time for documentation. I'd been focused on survival. I pulled out my camera and showed them the photos I'd managed to take. The massive footprints, the claw marks high on the trees, the crude shelter. They examined them carefully, passing the camera back and forth. The supervisor asked if I'd been injured during the pursuit. I showed them the scratches on my arms from the thorns, the tears in my clothes. They could see I was physically shaken, that something had clearly happened to me out there. But I could also see that they were trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a group of bears, maybe in the stress and fear of the moment, I'd misidentified what I was seeing. They were polite about it, professional, but the doubt was obvious. I filled out a formal report, writing everything down in as much detail as I could manage. My hands were still trembling as I wrote, making my handwriting almost illegible. But I got it all down. Times, locations, descriptions, everything. The supervisor said they'd send a team out at first light to investigate. I told them they needed to go in force. Multiple people, heavily armed. What I'd found wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything in their field guides. They nodded and said they'd take appropriate precautions. After the report was filed, I just sat there in that office for a long time. The supervisor had gone to coordinate the morning search party. The farmer had left to stay with a relative in town. He said he wasn't going back to his property until this was resolved. And I was alone with my thoughts, replaying everything that had happened. The image of that creature's face staring at me across the clearing, the sound of them crashing through the forest behind me, the sight of them standing at the edge of the farmyard watching us leave. What would the search party find tomorrow? Would the body still be there, or would the others have moved it, hidden it, erased all evidence that it had ever existed? Would they find the cave, the nest, anything at all to corroborate my story? Or would it all be gone, leaving me looking like someone who'd had a panic attack in the woods and let their imagination run wild? And if they did find something, if they confirmed that these creatures were real, then what? What do you do with that knowledge? How do you tell the world that everything they thought they knew about the natural world was incomplete? I didn't wait around to find out. I filed my report, gave them all the information I had, and left. I couldn't stay on that island any longer. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those creatures staring at me. Every sound made me jump. I was done. I caught the first ferry off the island the next morning and haven't been back since. I don't know what the search party found. They probably sent me a report, but I never opened it. Part of me doesn't want to know. Part of me needs it to remain a mystery. Sometimes I wonder if they found the body, if they confirmed that something unexplainable was out there. Other times I wonder if they found nothing at all, if the creatures removed all evidence and left the search party scratching their heads at my wild story. But mostly, I try not to think about it. I try not to remember that moment in the clearing when I first saw the body and realized everything I thought I knew was wrong. I think about the farmer sometimes. Does he still live on that property, or did he sell it and move somewhere safer? Does he lie awake at night listening for sounds in the darkness, wondering if they'll come back? And those creatures, are they still there, living in that cave, mourning their dead, going about their lives while the rest of the world remains ignorant of their existence? What haunts me most is the intelligence I saw in their eyes, the way they communicated, coordinated, showed emotion. These weren't dumb animals. They were thinking, feeling beings with complex social structures and behaviors. And we've spent centuries dismissing them as myth, as folklore, as the delusions of unreliable witnesses. How many other impossible things are out there, hiding in the remote corners of the world, dismissed by science because we can't accept that we don't know everything? I've been asked a few times if I'd ever go back, if I'd join another expedition to try and document these creatures properly, with cameras and backup and a team of researchers. And my answer is always the same: absolutely not. Some things in the wilderness are better left undiscovered. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Because once you've seen them, once you know they're real, it changes you. It changes how you see the world, how you understand your place in it. I used to be confident in my understanding of the natural world. I'd spent 15 years studying it, working with it, learning its rhythms and patterns. But now I know that understanding was incomplete. There are things out there we don't understand, things we've missed or chosen to ignore, things that exist in the shadows just beyond our awareness. And most of the time, that's probably for the best. Because once you've stood in a clearing at the base of a mountain and stared at something that shouldn't exist, once you've run for your life through a darkening forest with the sound of pursuit behind you, once you've felt that primal, absolute terror that comes from knowing your prey, you can't go back to seeing the world the way you did before. The forest is no longer just trees and animals. It's full of possibilities, of potential encounters, of things waiting in the shadows that we've convinced ourselves aren't real. I don't go into the wilderness anymore. Not alone anyway, and even when I do, I'm never more than a mile from my vehicle, never out of cell phone range, never anywhere remote enough that help couldn't reach me quickly. Some people might call that cowardly. But those people haven't seen what I've seen. They haven't felt what I felt. They haven't had their understanding of reality shattered in the span of a few terrifying hours. So that's my story. That's what happened to me on Kodiak Island when I was sent to track down what everyone assumed was just an aggressive bear. I found something else instead. Something impossible. Something that shouldn't exist but does. And I survived to tell about it, though sometimes I'm not sure if that's a blessing or a curse. Because now I have to live with that knowledge, that certainty, that our understanding of the world is incomplete. That there are mysteries out there we haven't solved, creatures we haven't cataloged, impossibilities that are somehow real. Some things in the wilderness are better left undiscovered. I know that now. I learned it the hard way. And I hope you never have to learn it the way I did. For more interesting stories, check this out.